The fluorescent lights hummed above polished linoleum as Rachel Torres moved through Seattle General in Norfolk like a ghost wearing scrubs. Invisible. Unremarkable. Exactly how she needed it. She wasn't supposed to exist here, not really. Not as Captain Rachel Torres. That version of her had been officially dead for 3 years, classified operation, redacted file, Pentagon eraser. Now she was just Rachel, the temp nurse nobody looked at twice, the one the permanent staff pretended wasn't in the room when they laughed about their weekend plans. The coffee in the break room was 12 hours old and tasted like burnt copper. She drank it anyway while charting medication times to the minute, each entry a perfect digital footprint that Dr. Mercer would eventually notice and resent. Her hands moved with surgical precision during 4 placements on the 4th floor, 18-gauge needle, smooth entry, blood return, tape, done. 3 minutes flat. The permanent nurses took 7, sometimes 8, their hands shaking slightly as they fumbled with the tourniquet. Rachel's hands were steady because they'd held lives together in worse places. In Fallujah, in the Jolin district, during a classified operation she would never speak about outside these walls. Her left forearm bore a thin scar running parallel to the radius, visible when she reached for supplies, which she did now, pulling 14-gauge catheters and normal saline from the crash cart with movements so economical they seemed choreographed. Room 347 was her assignment this shift. Colonel Vance lay in the hospital bed with a post-operative dressing that needed changing, his abdomen still wrapped in surgical gauze from the procedure Dr. Mercer had billed at $47,000 yesterday. The colonel didn't look up when Rachel entered. Most patients didn't. She was staff. She moved through their lives like a shadow, touching them, cleaning them, documenting their vital signs, then disappearing. That was the job. That was safety. How's the pain? Her voice came out soft, measured, the way she'd trained herself to speak around people who had authority. Not subservient. Just careful. Manageable, Colonel Vance said. His eyes remained on the television mounted in the corner, some news anchor talking about defense budgets and troop deployments. Rachel's jaw tightened for exactly 1 second, the only reaction she allowed herself. This man had signed the orders. This man had looked at a map 3 months ago and decided her 12-year-old son's entire unit should deploy to Syria. That her boy, Marcus, should be 1,800 miles away from home, carrying a rifle in a country where the ground itself wanted to kill him. She didn't let him see the tightness. Instead, she washed her hands in the sink, 30 seconds, antimicrobial soap, the ritual of clinical precision, and returned to his bedside with fresh gloves snapped on like small gunshots in the quiet room. The dressing change took 12 minutes. She was fast because speed meant less conversation, meant fewer moments where her voice might crack or her hands might betray her. She removed the old gauze, cleaned the incision site with chlorhexidine, and assessed the surgical wound with the clinical eye of someone who'd seen far worse. No infection. Good healing. The sutures were clean. Dr. Mercer had done adequate work, at least. That was something. You were military? Colonel Vance asked, just as she was placing fresh tape on the new dressing. Not a question directed at her exactly. More like a thought spoken aloud. Rachel's hands didn't pause. That was the key, and never let the hands betray the brain. No, sir, she said quietly. Just nursing. Your father. Just me in healthcare. The lie came smoothly because she'd practiced it 283 times since she took this job. Every deflection, every misdirection, choreographed and reinforced until it felt like truth. Captain Rachel Torres was dead. Buried. Classified. What remained was Rachel the temp nurse, the woman Dr. Mercer observed moving through the hallways like a competent ghost, too good to ignore completely, too quiet to fear. But Dr. Mercer was beginning to notice. She could feel it the way soldiers feel incoming mortars, a change in air pressure, a sixth sense developed through years of staying alive. He watched her from the nursing station this morning for 7 minutes, scrolling through her charting on his tablet, his jaw clenching slightly as he reviewed her medication documentation. Every entry logged to the minute. Every observation written with clinical precision. Every number accounted for. Those numbers were the problem. Her charting was too perfect, too detailed, which meant it exposed the gaps in everyone else's work. Especially his. Dr. Mercer had been billing phantom procedures through compliance staff for 8 years, procedures that never happened, complications that were invented, surgeries that existed only in the billing codes, and the silence of nurses who either didn't notice or didn't want to notice. Rachel noticed. Rachel documented every inconsistency in the margins of her shift reports, every discrepancy between what was billed and what actually occurred on the surgical floor. She'd been careful not to let it show. Just charting. Just doing her job. But careful wasn't the same as invisible. At 3 in the afternoon, Rachel left the hospital and drove home to a neighborhood where nobody knew her real name. The apartment was small, 1 bedroom, 1 bathroom, kitchen that smelled like the coffee she'd made at 5 that morning. She set her badge on the counter, took off her shoes, and climbed the stairs to check on Marcus. He was asleep at his desk, textbooks open, a half-written essay on the American Revolution abandoned next to his keyboard. 12 years old and already carrying so much weight. He'd asked 3 weeks ago why his unit had deployed to Syria. She'd told him it was complicated, that soldiers went where they were ordered, that this was what service meant. He'd accepted it the way he accepted everything now, quietly, without pushing, the way kids do when they sense their parents are already carrying the maximum load. She pressed her hand against his shoulder, careful not to wake him. Her fingers were cold from the hospital, from the hand washing and the antiseptic and the 18-gauge needles. She could feel her pulse in her temples, that familiar pressure that came when she thought about what was happening overseas. 143 Marines in his unit. Deployed to one of the most dangerous provinces in the country. And Colonel Vance had decided all of it without ever knowing that Rachel Torres, the same Captain Torres who had survived 3 tours in Baghdad, who held a silver star in a frame wrapped in plastic at the bottom of her locker, had a son in his chain of command. The irony was so bitter she could taste it on her tongue. Copper and ash, like burnt blood. She went downstairs and sat at the kitchen table with her laptop, pulling up the encrypted email she maintained on a secure server. Nothing new from the Pentagon contact, she didn't expect anything. That life was over. The classified operation was classified for a reason, which meant no phone calls, no status updates, no acknowledgement that Captain Rachel Torres had ever existed. She was a ghost with a social security number and a nursing license. The next shift started at 6 tomorrow morning. She would arrive 15 minutes early, pour the burnt coffee, move through the hallways like she didn't have a son deployed to Syria. Like she didn't have a medal of valor locked in a safe deposit box. Like she wasn't the most dangerous person in the building, capable of things the permanent staff couldn't even imagine, except they'd never imagine it because they didn't see her. Nobody ever saw her. At 7 that evening, her phone buzzed. A text from Marcus, asking when she'd be home for dinner. He was hungry. He'd finished his homework. Could they order pizza? She texted back immediately. Yes. Any toppings? Love you. That's all she had left, text messages and bedtime checks and the lie that she was just a nurse working double shifts. The quiet work. The invisible work. The kind that nobody appreciated until something went wrong and there was no one else to catch the falling pieces. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she was beginning to understand why Dr. Mercer thought he could get away with his scheme. Because nobody looked at the small people. Nobody paid attention to the ones working in the dark. That's what made them useful to people like him. And that's what made her dangerous to everyone. At 9:17 p.m., her hospital phone rang, an emergency roster change notification. She was being reassigned to the 3rd floor for the morning shift. Colonel Vance's floor. The place where everything would eventually start to unravel. Colonel Vance's floor. The place where everything would eventually start to unravel. Rachel pushes a medication cart down the 3rd floor corridor at Seattle General, her movements economical, her eyes tracking vital signs on the monitors as she passes each room. The fluorescent lights cast everything in that particular shade of institutional white that makes time feel suspended. She's been at this for 14 hours. Her feet ache. Her shoulders are tight. But her hands are steady, and that's what matters. At the nurse's station, Dr. Mercer stands in front of the unit board, the one where staffing updates and commendations used to go. Today it serves a different purpose. The red marker in his hand moves with the precision of a surgeon. Not because he is careful, but because he is certain of his work. He writes in capital letters, each one deliberate, each one a small act of erasure. Disciplinary actions. Underneath, in that same red marker, a name appears, Torres, Rachel, temp staff. Below it, improper medication documentation. Failure to follow standardized charting protocol. Rachel is 3 feet away, restocking supplies at the supply cabinet, when she becomes aware of what's happening. Not through any sound he makes, Mercer moves like a man who has choreographed humiliation before, but through the sudden shift in the room's attention. The way Dr. Patel's hand still over the keyboard. The way the candy striper's eyes flick toward the board and then away, as if witnessing a car accident. Rachel turns. Watches him finish the last letter. He steps back. Admires his work like an artist surveying a canvas. Then he turns to face her, and his smile is the smile of a man who knows exactly what he's doing. You document like you're preparing for a court-martial, he says, loud enough for the families waiting by the elevator to hear. Loud enough for the med students pretending not to listen. This isn't the military, nurse nobody. This is a hospital that runs on trust, not paranoia. Rachel's jaw tightens. Once. The muscle bunches at the hinge of her jaw for half a second, then releases. Her hands remain at her sides. She doesn't look at the families. Doesn't look at the other staff. She looks directly at Mercer's eyes, that flat, assessing stare that takes in his expression like she's reading a tactical map. She says nothing. Nothing to say. He sets the marker down on the counter. I suppose silence is policy in your world too. The families in the elevator vestibule are staring now. An older woman with a surgical mask hanging around her neck. A man in a pressed suit visiting someone upstairs. A young girl clutching a balloon that says "Get well soon" in cheerful cursive. Rachel can feel their eyes on her the way she used to feel sniper scope lasers on her shoulders during operations in Helmand Province. The weight of attention that means exposure. She turns back to the supply cabinet. Continues restocking. One item at a time. Gauze pads. For stands. Sterile gloves in size 7.5. Her movements are methodical, unhurried, stripped of any emotion that might suggest she's heard a single word. Mercer watches for another moment, then walks away. But not before she sees the satisfaction in his shoulders, the way he carries himself like a man who has just won something. He hasn't seen what she really is. None of them have. And that's what makes the humiliation so safe for him to deliver. He's writing her up in front of witnesses, and no one will ever believe she's anything but an invisible temp nurse who documents like she has something to prove. By 11:11 a.m., she's already been written up. By 2:15 p.m., the rumors have spread through the nursing staff like contamination. Rachel sits alone in the break room. The one with the cracked linoleum and the vending machine that dispenses coffee that tastes like burned plastic. She's unwrapped a protein bar, the same brand she's eaten every day for 3 years, and she sits with it in front of her, staring at nothing in particular. The break room's window looks out onto the parking lot, where Norfolk traffic crawls along the main road like blood cells through arteries. 3 nurses enter. They don't see her at first, or rather, they see her with the same quality of awareness one extends to furniture. Mendez, who laughed with her yesterday about a patient's ridiculous dream. Chen, who borrowed her ibuprofen at the start of the shift. And Rosita, who is saying something funny about a resident's attempt at intubation when they all spot her simultaneously. The laughter stops mid-sentence. Rachel watches them process her presence. Watches the calculation happen behind their eyes, the quick decision-making about what staying means. Who they'll be seen with. What Dr. Mercer might think. It takes exactly 4 seconds for Mendez to gather her phone. Chen follows immediately. Rosita lingers for half a moment, some small flicker of resistance crossing her face, before she stands and turns toward the door. Temp, one of them whispers. Just that one word, barely audible, as the door swings shut behind them. Rachel's hands tighten around the protein bar for one breath. 2. The granola cracks audibly between her fingers. Then she releases the pressure, sets the bar down on the table in front of her, and unwraps the next bite with the same mechanical precision she uses for everything else. Chews. Swallows. Doesn't cry. Doesn't tremble. Doesn't move from this chair for the full 20 minutes her break allows. Pain is data. She learned that in Baghdad, in the field hospitals where the injured came in faster than they could treat them, where emotion was a luxury that got people killed. This is information. This is a message from the institution itself: you don't belong here. This is a prediction of what happens when you threaten the people who run things. She finishes the protein bar. Drinks water from the fountain in the corner, the one that always runs too cold. Returns to the floor at 2:32 p.m., her hands as steady as they were this morning. At the nurse's station, Dr. Mercer is reviewing a chart with Dr. Patel. They don't acknowledge her approach, though she knows they see her. The way conversations stop when you enter a room is a language all its own. Rachel waits. 3 feet away. Close enough to be heard, far enough to be ignored. Mercer turns a page. Makes a note. Takes his time. The invisible woman wants something, he finally says, not looking up. Does anyone else hear breathing? Patel shifts uncomfortably. Closes his chart. Looks at the ceiling like it suddenly contained something fascinating. Rachel's knuckles whiten around her tablet, a real compression, not the subtle version she allowed herself in the break room. Her voice comes out level anyway. Colonel Vance's BP is 148/92. He's complaining of chest tightness. I want his EKG pulled before the next med round. Mercer glances at her. His eyes are the color of old water, the kind you find in abandoned buildings. Cold. Still. Reflecting nothing. Log it yourself, Casper, he says. I don't have time for ghosts. She logs it. Returns to rounds. Doesn't let her hand shake until she's back in Colonel Vance's room, with the door closed and no one watching. Even then, it's just her knuckles pressing hard against her thighs for 10 seconds. Breathing in through her nose. Out through her mouth. Tactical breathing. The kind they teach you before you deploy, before you learn that fear is a luxury and survival is a mathematics problem. Her phone buzzes in her pocket. A text from home: Mom, you okay? She reads it 5 times before she can type back. Her hands have to stop trembling first. Her son is 12 years old and he can feel her fracturing from 3 miles away. He carries her stress in his shoulders like his training to be a soldier himself, and she wonders, not for the first time, if the deployment she survived was worth the way she's failing him now. She types, long day. I'm fine. It takes her 3 minutes to send those 4 words. By 2:42 p.m., Rachel is back on her rounds. By 2:45 p.m., she's preparing the medication cart for the afternoon distribution. By 2:13 p.m., the stairwell door on the 3rd floor explodes inward with enough force to shatter the small window in its center. The sound it makes is like a gunshot. Like war. Like the past walking into the present with no apology and no warning. The 3rd floor hallway exploded at 2:38 p.m. A 300-pound man in a hospital gown and construction boots kicked through the stairwell door, AR-15 gripped in both hands, his voice a raw animal scream that turned the afternoon fluorescent white. Where's the doctor who killed my brother? The words didn't echo. They consumed. Every monitor on the floor flatlined in the seconds it took for panic to metastasize, a visiting family scattered backward into the pediatric ward, a resident dropped her tablet, an orderly vaulted over a rolling chair and sprinted for the opposite exit. The hallway became a corridor of animals running from predators. Rachel didn't run. She stood near the med cart, 60 feet from the gunman, her hand still holding the dressing she'd been restocking. The moment stretched like taffy. Everyone else was already gone, their feet pounding tile, their voices swallowed by the man's continued roar, a sound like a transmission exploding inside a throat. Rachel set down the gauze with the same care she would place a newborn. Then she walked toward him. Not fast. Not slow. The kind of walk that said, "I know exactly what I'm doing." The gunman's eyes found her. His hands tightened on the rifle. His knuckles went white. But Rachel's voice, that low, steady alto that had once negotiated with Taliban recruiters in the dust outside Fallujah, dropped another octave. "My name is Rachel. I need you to listen to me. Not a question. Not a plea. A statement of fact, the way you might tell someone the sun was rising. What's your brother's name?" The gunman's jaw clenched. His breathing was chaos, hyperventilation mixed with rage, the sound of someone whose lungs were screaming demands his body couldn't meet. Don't fucking move." "I'm not moving." Rachel took one more step. "I'm right here." "What's his name?" The rifle trembled. Just barely. But trembling. Then the first gunshot. A crack that split the fluorescent hum of the hospital into shards. The round went wide, through a patient window somewhere, glass singing its brief sharp song as it fell. The gunman had flinched. Guilt or grief or both had made him flinch, and now he was shooting because the flinch had scared him, and Rachel could see the spiraling clarity of his fear like a physical thing, like watching someone drown in 3 feet of water. "Stop," Rachel said. Same tone. Same authority. "I'm listening." "What's his name?" But the second gunshot was aimed. Security guard Marcus Martinez had moved, just 5 feet, just to block a stretcher with a post-op patient from the line of fire. The round hit him center mass, and the sound it made wasn't movie violence. It was wet. It was the sound of tissue betraying itself, and Rachel heard the hiss before she saw the wound, heard the pressure of air escaping from a punctured lung cavity like someone had opened a valve on damaged machinery. Martinez's hands went to his chest. His eyes looked at Rachel with the specific panic of a man who understood in that instant that he was dying. Rachel moved. The 14-gauge angiocouth was in her fingers before her conscious mind had finished the trajectory, 3 steps to the crash cart, left hand pulling the needle package, right hand already locating the second intercostal space, midclavicular line, the anatomical landmarks that lived in muscle memory from 13 years of medical training and 3 years of field medicine in a war zone where triage decisions happened in the space between heartbeats. "Get down." Behind the desk, she said to no one, to everyone. To Martinez. To the gunman. To the dying light of the afternoon. She didn't wait for compliance. The needle went in through skin, through fascia, and then, that specific hiss of air escaping, the sound of a chest cavity releasing pressure like a compressed spring finally allowed to breathe. The monitor that had been screaming downward O2 sat of 68, falling, suddenly shifted. 71, 74. 79, Martinez's shoulders relaxed. His breathing changed from panicked drowning to something almost human. The gunman lowered his weapon for exactly 10 seconds. That was the amount of time it took for 3 security officers to cross the hallway, moving in practiced formation. They'd trained for this, had run the drills, had stood in classrooms and talked about active shooters with the enthusiasm of people who didn't believe it would ever actually happen. But it was happening, and they were good, and they were moving with the kind of controlled aggression that comes from knowing your job is to stop a person from killing more people. The gunman saw them, seemed to recognize that his moment had passed, and his hands opened like a man releasing something heavy he'd been carrying too long. He dropped. The rifle fell with him, clattering against tile in that particular sound of metal giving up, and then there were officers on him, and plastic restraints, and the radio chatter that sounded like someone turning up the volume on static. Rachel's hands were still steady as the paramedics arrived, pushing her slightly aside to assess Martinez, who was already talking. The best sign, a patient who can talk is a patient whose airway is open. The oxygen saturation climbed steadily. 82, 86. 92. normal ranges. The sucking chest wound converted into something manageable, something a trauma surgeon could actually fix. She stepped back. That was when she noticed the silence. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of it, that specific weight of a room that had been screaming and wasn't anymore, the way air feels different after thunder. Her chest was moving with breath she didn't remember taking. Her scrubs were dry except for Martinez's blood on her left sleeve, dark against the blue cotton like a badge of something she wasn't supposed to wear. The intercom crackled. Dr. Mercer's voice came through the speaker system like something mechanical and cold. Security to 3rd floor. We have an unauthorized medical procedure in progress. Rachel didn't move. The security officers were still processing the gunman, were already calling for additional units, were speaking in that professional tone that meant the danger was categorized, contained, over. But the words unauthorized medical procedure hung in the air like a separate threat entirely, and Rachel understood with the clarity of someone who had seen how institutions work that she had just committed the ultimate violation. She had solved a problem that wasn't hers to solve. 2 security officers arrived within 90 seconds. Not the ones who tackled the gunman, different officers, these ones in shirts instead of tactical gear, their radios crackling with the mundane details of incident response. One of them said, and Rachel recognized in that single syllable the precise tone of institutional authority that was about to become hostile. "We need you to step back from the patient." She stood slowly. Her hands remained visible and open, the stance of someone who understood that compliance was its own form of communication. "Tension pneumothorax," she said quietly. "Second intercostal space." The hiss means the pressure release worked. "His O2 is normal now." "Yes. I understand. We just need you to step away." Dr. Mercer appeared 30 seconds later with the hospital administrator, a woman whose nameplate read Dr. Sarah Chen, whose expression was already calculating liability like a human spreadsheet. Mercer was pointing before he even fully closed the distance to Rachel, his index finger extended like an accusation given physical form. "She performed a surgical procedure without physician authorization. That's a scope violation and a liability nightmare. I want her badge pulled immediately." Rachel said nothing. Martinez was being loaded onto a stretcher, paramedics already establishing for access, already moving with the practiced efficiency of people who knew what came next. His eyes found Rachel for exactly 1 second, and in that second she saw recognition, not of her face, but of her competence, the specific gratitude of a man who understood he was alive because of her hands. The administrator looked at her. "Miss Torres, did you?" "She endangered this hospital," Mercer cut in, his voice rising, his hands now making shapes in the air like he was conducting an orchestra of consequences. "She used medical equipment without authorization. She contaminated the scene. I want her badge pulled and I want this documented as a protocol violation for her personnel file." The administrator's eye shifted from Rachel to Mercer to the empty space where Martinez had been. "We'll need to review the footage," she said carefully. "There is no footage to review," Mercer said. She was out of camera range. Rachel knew that wasn't true. The camera at the hallway intersection had a 240-degree field. It had captured everything. But she also knew that knowing something was true and proving something was true were separate processes, and that Mercer had already begun calculating how to make the proof disappear. The next 3 hours happened in that particular slow-motion velocity that follows institutional betrayal. Mercer made the first phone call at 2:59 p.m., to the credentialing office, citing protocol violations during a medical emergency and requesting immediate termination pending investigation. The second call came at 3:17, this one to the hospital administrator and the risk management director, in which he used the phrase scope of practice violation 7 times. The third call was different. Quieter. To someone in IT, giving instructions that Rachel couldn't hear but understood anyway, because she'd worked in hospitals long enough to know how information worked, how footage got corrupted, how incidents sometimes never made it to board reviews. By 4 p.m., she was escorted out. Security walked with her to the front desk, not aggressively, just present, just official. Her badge was deactivated at the terminal with a soft electronic chirp that sounded like a door closing. They asked her to clear her locker, and she did it in silence. 3 years of 12-hour shifts, of double coverage, of charting so meticulous it bordered on obsessive, all of it fitting into a cardboard box the size of a case of for saline. A stethoscope. 2 pairs of compression socks. A note from a patient's mother, dated 18 months ago, that said, "Thank you for saving my daughter's life." No explanation beyond protocol violation. No severance discussion. No HR meeting. Just security walking her to the parking lot while the afternoon hung around them like a witness to something ugly. Rachel sat in her car for 20 minutes before she turned the key. Her scrub still had Martinez's blood on the sleeve. Her hands were steady. Her breathing was under control. Her composure was perfect, the kind of perfect that comes from having learned long ago that falling apart was a luxury she couldn't afford, that the moment you let the wall crack was the moment everything behind it came pouring out and couldn't be stopped. She drove home in silence. The house was empty, her son still at school, wouldn't be back until 3:45, and it was only 4:23 now, only just barely past the moment when everything had changed. Rachel sat at the kitchen table in her blood-stained scrubs and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that she had just chosen a person she didn't know over the career that had been her only anchor to a normal life. She had walked toward a gunman. She had performed medicine without authorization. She had exposed herself. And in 3 hours, when the board met to review the hallway footage, Dr. Mercer would discover that the footage had mysteriously corrupted during a routine backup, a technical malfunction, unfortunate timing, nothing to be done. He would stand before the administrators and describe an incident of unauthorized medical practice. He would recommend termination. And Rachel Torres, the invisible temp nurse, would become even more invisible, just with no paycheck and no way to explain to her son why Captain Rachel Torres, who had come home every single day for 3 years, wouldn't be coming home anymore. Dr. Mercer didn't leave the stairwell immediately. He stood frozen at the observation window, watching the hallway feed on the monitor mounted above the nurse's station. His hand trembled slightly as he gripped the cold metal railing. Rachel Torres, the invisible temp nurse, was kneeling beside the security guard. Her hands moved with surgical precision. A 14-gauge needle. One smooth motion. The guard's oxygen saturation climbed on the portable monitor. 68. 75. 88. Everyone had scattered like startled birds, and she had walked directly into the storm. He pulled out his phone with a surgeon's steadiness, muscle memory overriding panic, and dialed the hospital administrator. His voice carried the practiced authority of a man who had never been questioned in any room. "Jim, Dr. Mercer. We have an unauthorized medical procedure happening right now in the 3rd-floor hallway. A temporary nursing staff member performing interventions outside scope of practice. Yes. During an active security incident. I'm concerned about liability. Significant liability." He paused, listening. "I'll send documentation." "Thank you." He hung up and immediately dialed credentialing. "This is Dr. Marcus Mercer, Chief of Surgery. I need to initiate an emergency termination review. Rachel Torres. Temp assignment. She just performed a surgical intervention without authorization. A needle decompression. Yes. On a security officer. No physician oversight. Another pause. Correct. Protocol violation. I'm recommending immediate removal from the unit and from the hospital system. I'll have written documentation submitted within the hour." The 3rd call was to security. "This is Dr. Mercer. The hallway confrontation on 3, I need the surveillance footage pulled before your report gets filed. The full 30 minutes. Yes. I understand what I'm asking. There's going to be significant liability exposure depending on what that footage shows. It's in everyone's best interest if we have clarity on the sequence of events before anything gets submitted to administration or risk management." He didn't wait for pushback. "It's Dr. Mercer. Make it happen." He ended the call and watched the monitor. Rachel was still there, checking the guard's pupils, her movements economical and calm. The hallway was chaos around her, nurses returning now that the gunman had been tackled and subdued, security personnel establishing perimeter control, someone calling for additional security on the radio. But Rachel remained motionless over her patient, her focus absolute. She looked like a photograph from a conflict zone. She looked like someone who had done this before. Mercer left the stairwell and descended to the administrative floor. By 2:27 p.m., the termination paperwork was on the credentialing director's desk. By 3:15 p.m., hospital IT had pulled the hallway surveillance from the system. He'd made certain Chen understood that the footage would be reviewed internally first, before any board inquiry. By 3:45 p.m., security escorted Rachel Torres from the building. She didn't argue. She didn't protest. Her badge was deactivated without ceremony. Her locker was cleared by another employee, nothing personal was packed with care, nothing was treated as if it belonged to someone with history in this place. By 4:02 p.m., she was standing outside in the Norfolk evening with a cardboard box containing a pair of compression socks, a half-eaten protein bar from the break room refrigerator, and a handwritten note from one of the younger nurses that she wouldn't find until she got home. Protocol violation. That was all the explanation she would receive. The drive home took 17 minutes. Rachel sat at every red light with her hands flat on the steering wheel, her jaw working silently, processing. She'd survived worse than job loss. She'd survived things that didn't have names. But this particular loss of something she'd finally allowed herself to have, settled into her chest like a stone. Her son's backpack was by the kitchen door when she walked in at 4:45 p.m. Homework spread across the dining table. A science project about ecosystems. A half-full glass of milk. The ordinary architecture of a child's Tuesday afternoon. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, still wearing scrubs, still carrying the smell of the hospital on her skin, antiseptic and something else, something metallic. The smell of blood that hadn't quite washed out completely. At 11:13 p.m., her son found her at the kitchen table, head in her hands, still in scrubs. She hadn't showered. She hadn't changed. She'd simply sat in the dark for 6 hours and let the weight of 3 years of careful deceit press down on her spine. Mom. His voice came small and tentative. 12 years old. Still young enough to be scared when his mother cried, old enough to know that something was genuinely wrong. Why are you home early? She couldn't answer. The answer required language she didn't have. The answer required her to say, I was a soldier. I did things the Pentagon wanted erased. They told me my daughter officially died so that the people I protected would be safer. And I agreed. And I lived that death for 3 years. I worked double shifts as a temp so nobody would ask questions. And today I saved a man's life in exactly the way I was trained to save lives, and it cost me everything I built here because the surgeon I work for is stealing money and I was starting to notice the patterns in the billing. She couldn't find any version of that sentence that wouldn't unravel the entire structure of the lie she'd been building, the carefully curated story of a widowed single mother with nursing school debt and no background in trauma medicine, just steady hands and good instincts. Instead, she reached out and pulled her son close. She pressed her face into his hair and held him without speaking. He wrapped his arms around her, confused but responding to something in her grip that said this wasn't something to question. This was something that required presence, not explanation. They sat like that for a long time. The kitchen clock ticked. The refrigerator hummed. Outside, Norfolk breathed in the October darkness. Somewhere in this city, Dr. Mercer was reviewing the deleted footage on a secure server, confirming that the evidence was gone. Somewhere in this city, Chen from IT was finishing a quiet email to the state medical board. Somewhere in this city, a security guard with a decompressed chest cavity was in the ICU, breathing easier because a woman nobody knew had walked toward him instead of away. But in Rachel's kitchen, there was only silence and the weight of 3 years pressing down, and her son not asking again, which somehow made it worse. At some point he fell asleep against her shoulder, and she carried him upstairs to his bed and tucked him under the covers, her military hand so careful with civilian softness that she was terrified she'd forget how to be gentle. She was downstairs again by 6:53 a.m., sitting with coffee she didn't taste, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. But 12 years of response training didn't shut off because she'd been fired. She picked up. "Is this Rachel?" A man's voice. Young. Panicked. A resident. "Rachel Torres? This is Dr. Huang from Seattle General. I got your number from. I can't say. But I need help. Colonel Vance crashed during a dressing change. I can't intubate him. The tube won't seat. He's cyanotic. Dr. Mercer's in the OR with another case and I can't reach anyone. I've been trying everyone and nobody's answering Anne." She hung up. The phone sat on the table. She stared at it like it was something that might detonate. Her son was asleep upstairs. She had no job. She had no clearance to be inside that hospital. She had no rights to that patient. She had everything to lose and absolutely nothing else to protect except the one person she'd built this entire invisible life around. She grabbed her keys and walked out the door. 2 days. That's how long Rachel had been home before the call came. She was standing at the kitchen sink, watching rain streak the window, when her phone rang. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer. Then she heard Dr. Chen's voice, tight and urgent. "Rachel, I need you back. Now." "I'm not authorized." Colonel Vance crashed during a routine dressing change. "Resident can't intubate. We're losing him." The phone went silent except for the distant sound of a monitor flatline in the background. Rachel was in her car 30 seconds later, her hands moving before her brain caught up. The drive to Seattle General took 12 minutes. She'd memorized every traffic light, every intersection, every possible route during her first week as a temp. Muscle memory. The kind that kept you alive in places where hesitation meant death. The rain hammered the windshield like a countdown she couldn't stop. By the time she reached the 3rd floor, her scrubs were soaked, her heart rate exactly where it needed to be. Clinical. Controlled. Not afraid. Trauma Bay 4 was chaos. A resident, too young, too panicked, was fumbling with an endotracheal tube while the nurse called out vitals. Colonel Vance's chest heaved. His oxygen sat dropping, 78. 71, 64. The ventilator kept hissing its mechanical complaint, but the tube wouldn't seat. His airway was swollen. Anaphylaxis, maybe. Or pure bad luck. Dr. Chen saw Rachel and his shoulders dropped with visible relief. Thank God. We need a surgical airway. Now. No one said anything about whether she was authorized to be there. No one said anything at all. They just moved. Rachel grabbed the crash cart and laid out her equipment with the precision of someone who'd done this under fire in the dark. Scalpel. Trocar catheter. The 14-gauge tube. She tilted Colonel Vance's head back, palpated the cricothyroid membrane, that small dip between the cartilage rings where life and death separated by millimeters. The room went absolutely silent. Boots on tile. 1, 2, 3. Her breathing steady. His heart rate climbing, 142. 148, 156. The monitor's rhythm looked like panic made visible, but her hands didn't shake. Never shook. That was the thing about operations in Baghdad. You learned what your hands were capable of when your brain wasn't allowed to interfere. The scalpel broke skin. She heard the soft resistance of tissue giving way, felt the needle penetrate the membrane, and suddenly the tube was in and secured and oxygen was flowing into his lungs and his SAT started climbing, 68. 74, 81. 88, normal. His eyes fluttered open. For a moment, nothing moved. The monitor beeped. Rain drummed the windows. Somewhere down the hall, a phone rang and no one answered it. Colonel Vance's lips moved. His voice was barely a whisper, but in the silence of that room, it carried weight like a confession. Phantom. The word hung there. That was the code name. Not her name. Not her rank. The operation in Baghdad, the one officially erased from the Pentagon's records, the one that didn't exist, the one that had cost her everything except her son and her hands and the faded unit patch sewn inside her jacket lining. Phantom. That's what they'd called her. The one who walked in invisible and walked out with intelligence that changed operations for 3 months across 3 provinces. No one outside that classified circle knew that code name. Except the colonel who commanded her. Dr. Chen's face went white. How does he? The door burst open. A Marine in dress uniform stepped into the trauma bay, and behind him walked a woman in an immaculate Navy service dress, her eye scanning the room with the kind of precision that came from reading military briefings for 40 years. Behind her came a man in a 2-star general's insignia, and the air in the room didn't just change, it pressurized, like the moment before an aircraft breaks the sound barrier. A Marine liaison. That was what Rachel thought first. Then she saw what the Marine was holding, a file. Red classified cover. Very old. Very serious. The Marine pulled a document from the folder and began reading, his voice formal and official. Captain Rachel Torres, Special Forces, Baghdad Operation classified under Presidential Order 12962. The door slammed open again. Dr. Mercer burst through like a man who'd been holding his breath underwater too long. His face was red. His voice climbed 3 octaves. This woman is not authorized to perform procedures. She's been terminated. This is liability. This is grounds for. The 2-star general didn't speak. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't even look at Mercer. He simply stepped forward, moved him out of the way with the gentle authority of someone who'd moved presidents and generals and prime ministers, and stopped 3 feet from Rachel. Every person in that room held perfectly still. The general's eyes locked onto hers. Then he looked down at her jacket, the one she'd pulled from her locker, the one she'd worn every shift for 3 years without anyone asking questions about the small lump of embroidered cloth inside the lining. Rachel unpinned the patch. The faded colors of a unit that officially never existed. The edges frayed from 16 years of being carried into places that didn't appear on maps. She held it in her palm, and the general reached down and traced the emblem with one weathered finger. Then he saluted. Not a casual gesture. The kind of salute that meant everything: acknowledgement, respect, the weight of classified service, the honor of having operated in the dark so other people could sleep at night. Rachel returned it, and when her arm dropped, she was crying. Not from fear. From the impossible weight of being seen. Of being known. Of 3 years of pretending to be invisible finally ending because a man with 2 stars on his shoulder had just told everyone in that room that Captain Rachel Torres was real, that her service was real, that Phantom was real. Dr. Mercer's face went the color of old bone. Behind the general, a figure in a Norfolk State Hospital IT uniform appeared in the doorway, a Navy veteran named Chen who'd spent the last 72 hours running forensics on the hospital's server logs. Chen looked at Mercer and nodded slightly. I'm uploading copies of the server deletion logs and your billing records to the State Medical Board as we speak, Chen said quietly. 5 years of phantom surgeries, Dr. Mercer. 5 years of claims for procedures that never happened, kickbacks from device manufacturers, inflated billing codes. The FBI got the packets 15 minutes ago. The administrator arrived 30 seconds later with 2 board members flanked by security. The words came out measured and final. Dr. Mercer, your privileges are suspended immediately pending investigation. Effective now. Security will escort you from the premises. Mercer's voice cracked. I built this department. I have colleagues who are currently being interviewed by federal agents, the administrator said. She didn't blink. She didn't even sound angry. Just tired. The kind of tired that came from discovering you'd hired a criminal. Security moved toward him. Dr. Mercer tried to argue, tried to threaten, tried to remind everyone about his reputation and his connections and the lawyers he'd call, but the words just got louder and emptier until the elevator doors closed behind him and the only sound left was the hiss of oxygen and the steady beep of a cardiac monitor that had returned to normal. The two-star general looked at Rachel. "Your reinstatement paperwork is being processed right now. Director of Emergency Medicine. Effective immediately. You've got a department waiting for you, Captain. And we need people like you running the medical side of things for the region." It wasn't a request. It was a command. Rachel nodded once. "Understood, sir." He saluted again. Then he turned and left, the Marine liaison following, the file tucked back under his arm. Dr. Chen started to smile, then caught himself. "Welcome back, Captain." Rachel looked down at Colonel Vance, whose eyes were tracking her with something that might have been gratitude or might have been the understanding that the woman who'd just saved his life 3 years ago was someone he'd never actually known at all. "Get into imaging," Rachel said, her voice dropping an octave now that the mask had finally fallen away. "I want to see those lung fields. And someone get me a coffee. Black. I'm going to be here for 18 hours. No one questioned the authority in those words anymore. The rain kept drumming against the windows as Seattle General's new director of emergency medicine walked back into her life, and this time, everyone knew exactly who she was. Hit that like button if you appreciate the nurses and healthcare workers in your life. Drop a comment if you've ever worked in medicine or know someone who has. Subscribe and let's see what happens next.